Today, we're going to talk about something that's deeply personal and for many, incredibly painful. It's a paradox, really. It's called church hurt. And it's this wound that happens in the very place people go to find refuge, to find healing. So to even begin to understand how to heal, we first have to get real about the wound itself.
In this quote, this just gets to the absolute heart of it. A survivor named Marlene said, "I was looking for them to help me, but yet I was being rejected." You hear that? The pain isn't just disappointment. It's a profound betrayal. It's walking into a sanctuary needing help and getting rejection instead. And that contradiction, well, that's what makes this wound so uniquely devastating.
So what are we really talking about here? Well, researchers have a definition for it. They call it a deep distress that comes from a violation of sacred trust. And let's be clear, this is not just about having your feelings hurt. This is about a core promise, a promise of a safe, spiritual community being shattered. And when that happens, it can just rock a person's sense of security, and sometimes even their faith.
And that violation of trust, it has a staggering impact. Take a look at this number, 4,000. That's how many churches in the U.S. close their doors every single year. Now, there are a lot of reasons for that, of course, but researchers consistently point to unresolved conflict and church hurt as huge contributing factors that are driving people away. The sense of loss here is just immense, not just for one person, but for entire communities.
This brings us right to the core of the paradox, doesn't it? How does a place that's designed for healing become a source of such profound harm? Let's dive into that painful contradiction.
This is a really haunting image from psychologist Dr. Diane Langberg. She was visiting a former slave castle in Ghana, and she saw people worshiping in a beautiful chapel that was built directly on top of the dungeons where unimaginable human suffering took place. It is such a powerful metaphor for any institution that goes through the motions of faith while ignoring or even enabling deep wounds right there within its own walls.
Okay, so if that's the paradox, what are the actual causes? To really understand the wound, we kind of have to dissect it, look at its anatomy. And the research breaks it down into a few key areas.
Now, every story is unique, but the causes often fall into three big interconnected buckets. The largest piece of the pie here, a whopping 45%, is the abuse of spiritual authority. That's followed by a deep betrayal of trust, which can come from leaders or even people you thought were friends. And finally, you have conflicts that are just ignored, mishandled, or just left to fester and turn toxic. And so much of this really boils down to the leadership model. The biblical ideal is what's called servant leadership. These are leaders who empower, who protect. But the damaging reality we so often see is authoritarian leadership, which uses spiritual language to control and dominate. It essentially turns authority into a weapon. And here's the direct impact of that. As another survivor, Stephanie, put it, this betrayal of trust is often the most damaging part. Think about it. When the very people who are supposed to be shepherds become a source of fear or harm, it just destabilizes everything. I mean, who are you supposed to turn to when your guides are the ones causing the pain?
So, that's the wound. It's heavy stuff. But how can someone even begin to heal from this kind of sacred wound? Well, the sources frame this transformation not as something you just wait for, but as an active, intentional journey.
And that's really the central question, isn't it? How do you begin to heal when the wounds are spiritual? When the hurt is all tangled up with your faith, your community, and your understanding of God? The path forward is, well, it's not exactly straightforward. It means you have to address the spiritual injury right at its core.
A huge part of the healing process is what's called reclaiming the narrative. It means you start to reframe the pain, not as the thing that defines your story, but as a crucible. A really painful process for sure, but one where a new purpose can be forged. It's about finding where God is at work, even in the middle of all the human failure.
The biblical story of Joseph is just a perfect model for this. I mean, after being betrayed and sold by his own brothers, he eventually gets to a place where he can say this to them. He doesn't deny what they did. He says, "You intended to harm me." But then he reframes the whole story through the lens of God's bigger, redemptive plan. But God intended it for good.
So what does this wrestling well actually look like? Well, the sources suggest a three-part framework. First, you have to acknowledge the real pain. No spiritual bypassing, where you use nice-sounding faith phrases to shut down real emotions. Second, you practice lament. You honestly cry out to God with all your anger and grief. And third, you begin the slow, hard work of rebuilding trust, not necessarily in people, but in the character of God Himself.
But here's the thing.
Individual healing is only half the story. For real, lasting change to happen, the community itself has to take responsibility. It has to create an environment where these wounds are just less likely to happen in the first place.
So the sources offer a blueprint for this. It starts with an absolute, non-negotiable commitment to protect the vulnerable. That's number one. It requires radical transparency in leadership and finances. No more secrets. It calls for restorative justice, which focuses on actually repairing the harm, not just punishing people. And crucially, it requires leaders who model humility and are willing to repent publicly when they get it wrong.
And this is such a key distinction. A healthy church isn't one where nobody ever disagrees. I mean, that's impossible. A healthy, safe church is a community that has the skills and the humility to walk through conflict in a constructive way, with both grace and truth, so that disagreements don't fester and become these deep, lasting wounds.
And that leaves us with a final, really challenging thought. What if confronting this issue, head-on, could actually transform one of the church's greatest failures into its most powerful testimony? A testimony not of being perfect, but of being redeemed. And that question, it might just hold the key to turning a sacred wound into a sacred story.